Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christiaan Kutlik.
And today we're going to continue our journey through the two, right now existing, Zack Snyder DC Universe films with Batman vs. Superman. We're really considering this a part two, so if you haven't listened to the Man of Steel podcast, we really would think it's best that you do.
Yeah, and like every way Batman vs. Superman canon carries on what Man of Steel started. So it is good to at least listen to our Man of Steel episode and at least get caught up on the plot and everything.
Yeah, the thing that's funny about this is, we're going to get into the origins of this film, which are interesting in themselves. But just like most things in Hollywood, Batman vs. Superman was one of those ideas that wouldn't die. We've gotten into early 2000s Warner Brothers superhero stuff on multiple podcasts now. On the last one, on the one concerning the Nolan trilogy as well. We're going to jump back to 2001 once again to start the story for Batman vs. Superman. Andrew Kevin Walker in 2001, while they're already doing pitches for Superman and Batman, pitches a Batman vs. Superman movie. I'm not quite sure how much influence he had over the script. Walker, probably best known for Seven, but apparently quite a prolific fixer at Warner Brothers for scripts from that point on. They get Akiva Goldsman, who had done Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, to write a draft of a Batman vs. Superman story. The one real interesting aspect of that is it does very much seem to pick up from Batman and Robin, as weird as that is.
The Schumacher was going to make a sequel to Batman and Robin, but because Batman and Robin kind of flopped critically and financially, they full stopped that.
Yeah, we've already stated our intention to go back and do a lot of the 90s Batman stuff as his own podcast, but there was a script called Batman Triumphant that would have followed Batman and Robin. This is sort of an alternate take on what the sequel to that would be. The biggest tip-off that it is following Batman and Robin is that it has a holographic AI Alfred, which is not terribly dissimilar to where things are at the end of Batman and Robin. I'm going to run through some of the plot points of this really quickly. Some of them are pretty funny. First, we start with a retired Batman, 5 years out from the last time he's been in action. We learn that Dick Grayson has died, which I think is kind of an important thing going forward.
What?
Alfred is already dead. Obviously, the Joker was already dead if we're following sort of the basic continuity of the Burton films. And also, Jim Gordon is dead. Batman is about to get remarried, as Superman has gone through a divorce with Lois Lane and is a little miserable. I'm not even going to go through everything.
This is already pretty miserable. Wow.
The script is really easily found on the internet. It leaked years ago, and Warner Brothers obviously never intending to use it, never really stopped anyone from distributing it. So it's out there if you want to read it. Batman gets married to a perfect woman. Superman being in his one of his groomsmen. She is killed almost immediately after the wedding by a Joker toxin bee. Of course, mirroring James Bond. And this sends Batman into crazy, vicious Batman who does not care about anything and just wants to kill the Joker, who he thought was dead but isn't. I'm going to skip a ton of this script, but it ends up being that Lex Luthor created a clone of the Joker to put Batman and Superman into conflict. And obviously that doesn't happen at the end.
I don't even know how to respond to any of that. That is off the wall.
But I think what's interesting is there are certainly things in the film we're about to talk about for quite a while that do mirror some of that. So obviously that script never gets off the ground. It was intended for a 2004 release was the idea. Doesn't happen. There is an often cited reference to it in I Am Legend from 2007. Francis Lawrence, who was the director on that film, said that was a joke because Akiva Goldsman had worked on that script and he was aware of it. But there was also some rumblings that it was still on the table if Superman Returns had done a little better. Obviously, even at that point, Batman was super hot again. So I could see them continuing to talk about the concept, even if it wasn't going to be that original script. All right, now we can do our little fast forward. Like we said, listen to the Man of Steel podcast. Now we're back post Man of Steel. So during the production of Man of Steel, they're already talking about Man of Steel 2. The idea of Batman being the adversary for Superman comes from Snyder somewhere in the production of that, just thinking that it's sort of a natural villain for him to fight. I guess not so much a villain, but considering that they're establishing a world where it's very clear that Superman is not a comfortable concept for anyone, that Batman, if he were to exist, would probably react kind of poorly.
I mean, you kind of see this strain in several other comic books too, that everyone tends to react to Superman pretty poorly. They did this, of course, in the 52 a little bit, but it is, I think this is a natural idea because even way back in like the 70s and 80s, Batman and Superman were kind of always shown as like ideologically different. They're both heroes, but one is always shown as day and one is always shown as night. And, of course they want to fight.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly from Snyder too, it's very influenced by The Dark Knight Returns. Superman is actually portrayed as even more of a villain to Batman's ethics, I guess, at that point, which I think is interesting because here Superman isn't really a puppet of anyone. I think it kind of almost works better that they're both good guys. They just aren't seeing eye to eye.
Yeah, I think that works too. We'll get into it once we actually get more into the plot because I do think there's some problems with it, but on the face surface, I don't think it's a dumb idea.
Yeah, and I think the move away from, like I was saying, the Miller Superman specifically in The Dark Knight Returns, his flaw comes from him being a puppet, which is not really what happens with this Superman. So I think that little adjustment is really helpful moving forward. Story credit to Zack Snyder and David Goyer. Screenplay, David Goyer and Chris Terrio coming on. Terrio going to be a pretty important name since this script. Also writer on Argo. Directed by Zack Snyder. Scored by Hans Zimmer with Junkie XL. Budget of estimates are around $300 million. Makes $873.6 million. So once again, not a failure, not the type of numbers that the studios are looking for right now.
I think the studios have also found that these movies have a lot of leg to them. Mostly with blockbusters, they kind of come in and then go away. But I think right now Warner is discovering that these movies kind of have a lot of like marketing appeal, oddly enough, despite the critical and online backlash to them.
Yeah, and that's something we're definitely going to get into as we go through this. But I agree with that. I think, with the Snyder Cut of Justice League announced, it's shown that obviously they're continuing to make money off of this. And there has been a pretty vocal group who have supported this film from the beginning. I have to say, one of the things I like about this movie is it dives right into the Batman origin. They do it in kind of like a dreamy way, which is cool, and that comes into play even later in the sequence. A lot of criticism on this. Some people criticizing that it seemed odd that, the prominent Wayne family would be gunned down in the middle of the street with no one around and no one would notice what was going on. Some people criticize the fact that Thomas and Martha Wayne are both fairly aggressive in trying to stop the robbery. The first argument, okay, my brain still goes, it's a movie. Second argument, I don't get it all. I think, if anything, it kind of made me like them more.
Well, who doesn't want to not get shot? Like, I feel like anybody in that situation would go in to defend themselves. I know Batman is usually portrayed in these origins as just watching his parents get gunned down after his parents try to help him. That's usually the most common origin with that. I don't even think you need these scenes at all. I don't think they really add anything because everyone kind of knows the Batman origin at this point. But my main complaint is that, there's nobody in the street. But I think they say it's a private screening later. But I guess that's kind of also negated later on when Bruce Wayne literally lifts up on like a cloud of bats out of the Batcave. So it is like very much a dream sequence and very surrealized because of that. But I don't really take issue with it besides like that just odd context because you see that before you realize it is a dream sequence.
that's something I actually love in this movie is that parallel between Batman and Superman is both of them fixate on memories as their motivation. As you're saying, I like the more aggressive Thomas and Martha Wayne. In fact, something in my head kind of makes Batman make more sense that way. If like he saw his father trying to fight back unsuccessfully, like that's a type of trauma too. It also introduces the first time we hear Martha in the film. As Thomas dies, he says Martha. That leads pretty directly into the audience getting to see the final battle from Man of Steel from Bruce Wayne, Batman's point of view. There's also a use of on-screen text a lot in these sequences, which I kind of like because it almost immediately separates it from Man of Steel, where like you know you're following kind of Batman for a little while and things look different.
Well, I also think it's a way to get information across very fast, which is something this film was criticized for. That's especially true in the dream sequences as well. But it is a bit of a Snyder motif. He does that a lot in Watchmen, and that's basically the entire premise of Sucker Punch. I think that's just a way for Snyder to kind of quickly establish key plot lines. But if you're not like paying attention, like some people weren't, it feels like underexplained.
And this is where I'm always admittedly not sympathetic. I feel like if you aren't paying attention, then I don't especially care if you perceive something. I always find, and we talked about this in Rise of Skywalker, I find Terrio's like machine gun pacing on everything refreshing. I think Marvel has conditioned audiences so much to expect everything to be explained all the time that it's kind of hurting because people think that's how you should make a movie, and I don't necessarily agree. I think, as even you were saying, we're so familiar with the origin of Batman. Do we really need to spell out every piece of it?
No, I think you could just jump straight into the Superman attack and kind of inform the viewer a lot more that way than having to go back and show like this dream sequence of Batman. I think it helps thematically, but I don't think it helps really narratively.
I would agree to a certain extent, but I think the thematics are so heavy that I would miss it if it wasn't there. Like, I need to know that Batman is having these same sort of like visions that Superman has. It's also that continuing elevation of these figures into more mythical than like science fiction. So I don't mind that at all. By the way, a lot of the notes I'm using, just to clarify, are going to be from the Ultimate Edition, which is the longer R-rated cut. I know Christian reviewed the theatrical cut just to kind of give us some balance. Largely, most people agree that the Ultimate cut is a little better because it does explain some things that maybe the theatrical cut doesn't flesh out as much. I enjoyed both cuts when I watched them, so neither really bothered me. The next sequence is going to be Lois, somewhere in the Middle East, investigating a terrorist group. That quickly goes to hell, with Superman having to intervene to save her. This is the first part of... Well, here we go, spoilers. This is the first part of the very expansive Lex Luthor plot.
The ridiculously convoluted plot. But it does work, so I gotta hand it to them on that. A lot happens here. Like, you wouldn't really notice that Jimmy Olsen's the one that gets like his brains blown out there. It is supposed to be Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen investigating this, and I believe Jimmy Olsen's part of the CIA. But then things very quickly go out of control. Originally, I believe the Mercenaries was Deathstroke, but then Justice League said, "No, you're an idiot for thinking that. That is not Deathstroke."
The mercenary here is actually KG Beast.
Oh, okay. I knew it had to be somebody.
There are really light references to it. Obviously, his real name is the same. And also, later on in the film, when Batman is investigating and he pulls his file, it does say the Beast, which is what they've more commonly called him recently, because KGB not being as relevant. But he does pop up as KG Beast. I really like that because I like KG Beast. That's fine. I think this sequence, and in all honesty, we may kind of breeze over plot points in this one more so than we did even in Man of Steel, just because there are so many. The broad strokes are kind of what are important here. I think what this scene does is immediately establish that Superman is not this government puppet and that he's acting of his own will positively, because we see that the government's about to blow up that entire area had Superman not intervened. And this is where we first see that conflict played out in Batman vs. Superman. It's hinted at the end of Man of Steel, but doesn't quite come to fruition because for the most part, he is working with the military throughout the third act of that film.
Here, they quite quickly throw you into this terrorist hostage situation that Superman almost immediately fixes. It also plays a little bit with 9/11 imagery, especially during the Superman attack in Gotham and Metropolis. And here they kind of play a bit more with like the war and terror more explicitly here than they did in even Man of Steel. And I think this is mostly a direct political comment from Snyder on this situation, though him throwing Superman into this situation, I think, kind of muddles things.
I don't know if it's a direct comment on the situation. I think it's taking something that, is relevant to a lot of your audience and saying, okay, like, we're in the real world now. Superman exists. How does this affect anything? And it also starts playing with that idea of like higher order justice than just government, which of course Batman is a comment on too. He's more down on the streets, but they're both essentially going against the law to try to act in a higher order. Moving forward from that scene is when you start getting all of your plot points. Let's try to just get through the basics of this. This may not be in order it is in the movie. Let's try to hit all of the points that are controlling this plot. First off, we already blew it if you haven't seen the movie. Lex Luthor is behind pretty much everything going on in the movie. Batman at this time is investigating something illegal Luthor is shipping. He doesn't quite understand what that is when we start the film. Superman, via Clark Kent, is investigating Batman in Gotham because Batman seems to have gotten pretty vicious. There's also evidence that Batman's brandings, which he's literally branding criminals, are leading to murders within the prisons. Lois is trying to figure out what the hell happened on her investigation because none of it really made any sense, which is another tip-off towards Luthor. And all this time, Luthor's ultimate goal is to take possession of the Kryptonian technology and eliminate Batman and Superman.
Yeah, that's the very gist of it. There's also like Lois Lane talking to senators, and the bigger like overarching plot of this is the government kind of wants Superman to answer for what happened in the Middle East or whatever happened with Lois Lane. And that's kind of the big crux for Lex Luthor to kind of coax Superman out from the sky and down onto the earth.
Right, that's your plot with Senator Finch, who is also interacting with Luthor. In addition to this, you also have Diana Prince running around, who's trying to figure out what Luthor is doing as well, knowing it's somehow related to what we are going to end up calling metahumans.
Right. I believe she originally investigates Luthor because she knows he has something on her, but not exactly what. But Batman finds out he has a pretty extensive file on metahumans across the world. And that later on, Luthor found some kind of secret weapon against Superman.
Right. And that secret weapon being the radioactive parts of the terraforming machine, which are now kryptonite. And all of this is happening in rapid succession, which is why we didn't bother putting it in order, because it's kind of all intercut. What it ends up being is it's really putting all of our main characters sort of in conflict with each other, all trying to judge the intentions of the other. Batman's primary belief being that Superman is sort of too powerful to exist because if he turns on everyone, we're all dead, which is true. And Superman is trying to sort of figure out what it means to be truly just, I think would be a fair assessment.
Oh, and we are missing one last important thing, and that is Batman's dream about Apocalypse evading Earth.
Right. Batman has what seems to be more than a dream about an apocalyptic invasion of Earth involving Superman as a pawn of presumably Darkseid. I don't think we have to say presumably as much anymore now that we've seen footage of Darkseid for Zack Snyder's Justice League. It's a very long sequence. It's pretty cool. I think it stands out as one of the big moments in the movie. And we get our first glimpse of like parademons on screen, which is pretty sick.
Yeah, it is definitely one of the cooler sequences. I think knowing the Snyder Cut is coming out helps kind of boost that scene a lot more because it can kind of see it building the legs for what will become the Snyder Justice League.
Immediately following this scene is also our first glimpse at the Flash. This was pretty criticized too, because a lot of people are saying, like, how would you know who it is? And the question I pose is, why do you care who it is if you don't know yet? You just know it's someone breaking through something.
Well, I think most comic fans would know it's the Flash because it's a guy going really fast and he's wearing red. I mean, Batman wouldn't know, of course, but I think the audience kind of knows. And again, this is kind of just like, I think, one of many nitpicks against this film.
An open-minded audience that isn't going in with any type of criticism is just going to go like, oh, what was that? That's probably important. And why is he talking about Lois Lane being the key? I have zero problem with it on any level. And it bothers me when it gets criticized because I think there is a bias. And I think if, Quicksilver showed up punching his head through time, people would have just been excited.
That criticism also comes from people that just don't like the Snyder films. And
Right.
I think also like it's paced very oddly because Batman's going to sleep and he has this dream or vision or whatever you call it. That's kind of without much context. And then he wakes up into the Flash kind of breaking through time and warning him. And then he wakes up again.
But it does then imply that he's not just like making this up in his head, that it means something, that there is more going on than just Batman and Superman at this point even.
Right, yeah. It's supposed to say that Batman believes there is something more at stake than what he originally believed. I'd say I don't know how much I think it's needed because Batman was already screaming at Alfred about Superman at this point. He's already investigating Lex Luthor at this point, and he kind of goes up to Alfred and he's like, if there's even a 1% chance, we have to have some kind of failsafe. And that's even before the dream sequence. It's
pretty rapid fire around this time that you start to get a lot of the thematics really like hammered in. You have Senator Finch on Charlie Rose, which is I did enjoy the fact that they used a lot of real news figures in this. And Charlie Rose in the scene poses the question, must there be a Superman? And Finch's response is there is, which is sort of the motivation of, the public is, okay, we're in this situation. What is this guy? Clark Kent at the Daily Planet is criticized by Perry White and is told you don't get to decide what the right thing is, which is pretty on the nose. And this is also where we get more interaction between Bruce Wayne and Diana as all of the investigations are starting to kind of collide, which of course isn't a good thing because that means that there is one bad guy controlling everything who we later find out is Luthor. Around here you have Wayne realizing that Luthor has a weapon to stop Superman. He goes and steals the kryptonite, crafts it into anti-Superman armor. At the same point, Luthor is playing around with the Kryptonian technology and is able to recreate Doomsday. What I like about that is they do kind of acknowledge the comic book origin of Doomsday being this clone that was kind of recloned and recloned and recloned. And it's really Luthor looking into the history of Krypton and picking out the most terrible thing. As Batman's figuring out what's going on, he does realize that this is some sort of anti-Superman weapon that Luthor, via the White Portuguese, is transporting. He goes to stop them or take the weapon, I suppose. He does so in the really cool Batmobile sequence you need in every movie with a Batmobile. It's big. Batman kills everybody because this Batman doesn't give a shit. And he's eventually stopped and warned by Superman. This is the do you bleed scene that also gets ridiculed. Once again, I don't think there's any problem with it.
The do you bleed line, I think that just got mocked a lot because that was the big line in the trailer. A lot like the lines in Star Wars, such as I have the high ground, they fly now, I hate sand. It's just one of those lines that...
Right, if you're going in with the impression that it's stupid, then you're going to think it's stupid even in context, would be the idea. We'll come back to that again too, unfortunately. But this does sort of... First of all, I think it's a really cool sequence because of how it plays out. You know for a fact that now Batman is just he's been ground down into Dark Knight Returns Batman, where he's going to just wipe out whoever he needs to accomplish his goals. Superman, I think more so than in Man of Steel, especially because in Man of Steel, he's fighting Kryptonians who have training, who are arguably better at being a supervillain than he is at being a superhero. You don't really see Superman as, like, unstoppable. Superman stopping the Batmobile and, like, floating, waiting for Batman to come out of the car is pretty impactful as far as the message of the level of power this figure has.
Right, and of course he says, when you see the light in the sky, don't go to it, the bat is dead, and then the exchange, do you bleed?
Right, and of course, you know, like, I think it's important to remind people, too, that this is part of Luthor's plot, that he's been manipulating information about Batman, making him sound even worse than he is, so Clark Kent investigates and thinks that he's, like, you know, just a psychopath. And he's not just a psychopath. He's a wonderful psychopath we all like. It's not long after this scene that Superman does decide to speak at I guess what's supposed to be like a Senate hearing.
It's a Senate hearing over what happened in the Middle East with Lois Lane, because they're not sure what happened, and they think Superman caused the destruction of the base, which isn't the case.
There are witnesses who we find out have been manipulated. This plays out a little more violently in the Ultimate Cut, which I prefer. I think it warrants an R, and it gets an R. The biggest being Wallace Keith, who we've seen throughout the film as someone who once worked for Bruce Wayne, was injured pretty terribly during the Superman's fight against Zod, and is holding a pretty big grudge against Superman. We learn a couple of things pretty rapidly here, that Keith is being manipulated by Luthor to speak against Superman, and also Luthor has hidden a bomb in the wheelchair that he has given him.
Yep, and then the wheelchair goes off and it kills everybody in the Capitol building.
Yeah, for the most part. They do show Superman saving who he can. Obviously, Superman is not blown up by a typical bomb. The question becomes, how did Superman not know what was going to happen? We do find out that is because the bomb was trapped in lead casing, because we're now building Luthor as the person who has been working on trying to beat Superman and is figuring out the science behind it.
Right, and then Superman also gives a big speech about how he wasn't looking, and because he wasn't looking, a lot of people died. And then, of course, there is protests outside, both for Superman and against Superman.
This really devastates Superman. The Superman coming out of Man of Steel isn't all that sure of himself to start. If you put it in context with the fact that his biggest victory was essentially having to kill the last piece of his homeworld, regardless of the criticism on that, if you think Superman should have killed him or should not have killed him, it's made very clear within the film that it's not something Superman was comfortable with doing, even though he did it. I think this is an extension of that. This is, you know, as questioned before, this is Superman having to question, can anyone even try to be what he's trying to be? And we've seen throughout this movie footage over and over and over again of Superman definitely saving people and definitely trying to do what's best, but it seems like things keep turning on him. At this point in the movie, we pretty much know that part of the reason for that is someone is working against him.
I want to point to Havill's performance here, because he does do a lot of body language, like I said, in Man of Steel, but he does it here as well, showing that there is a great burden on him with these powers. Like, often when he's saving these people, he is, online critics said, constipated, but he is mostly burdened by the weight of his powers and questioning whether he is actually doing the right thing in all these sequences.
Like you said, a lot of critics pointed this out, that sort of attitude. I like it. I like the idea that Superman is a person and isn't necessarily this, like, messianic figure right away, and that he has to work through it to get there. Because to me, if he does get there, I have a feeling it's going to be even more pointed in the Zack Snyder Justice League. It's very clear this is supposed to be a journey. Superman, distraught, not sure of what his place in all of this really is, heads off to what appears to be like the Himalayas, something to that effect, and is heading up a mountain. The locals, say he's come to die, obviously not knowing that would be very difficult for him to do on the mountain. But when he gets to the summit, he's contemplating, and he has a vision of his father. And his father tells a story about how even the best intentions can have bad consequences, but that's not necessarily a reason not to act. It's probably supposed to be something that Clark had heard from Jonathan when he was younger, and he's remembering. But I think anytime any character in these movies has anything that's sort of a vision, you know it's important, which I like. And I think this is sort of the ultimate one for this film. It's Superman realizing that there's no such thing as an action without consequences, but that's also not justification to not try to do the right thing. That kind of parallels his Jonathan Kent's death in Man of Steel, as well. As Jonathan Kent is trying to do the right thing and ends up dying because of it, but ultimately allows his son to make the decision to become... I think destiny is fair with how mythologically we're playing these characters, but without Jonathan Kent, there is no Superman, and I think this hammers it home again.
If Man of Steel was about anything, it was about choice. And then Batman vs. Superman is about the effect your choices have. Batman vs. Superman is also a lot about justice and what justice means. But at the core of Clark Kent's story here is the consequences of his choices.
He's conversing with his father, and the point of how did you get over it comes up, and Jonathan says, Martha, that's how he was able to cope with all of these problems, which then brings in the idea that the solution to all of this is love, and that you have to focus on love and have faith in that it will ultimately save you.
Of course, Justice League expands on this a little bit too, in that for Clark Kent, Lois Lane was his guiding morality in all of this. And of course, Lois Lane was also the one that encouraged Superman to go to the trial and speak his case.
And she's not only the guiding force in his morality, she's also his solace. That if anything goes wrong, he does have someone to turn to.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess, in some way the counterpoint to Batman here. That Batman has almost dismissed Alfred, as we see the way he speaks to him, as, you know, Alfred has grown more dissatisfied with Batman's choices. Superman is learning to embrace love, while Batman still has to learn that.
And then I'm not sure where Lex Luthor fits into all of this, because he's such a wacky character in this. But I believe with him, love is also a problem, because he mentions his father beats him.
He's so disassociated from reality that he's maybe unable to love. And like, this is where that mythological thing really comes into play. Is, you know, Luthor is hubris and manipulation, and the idea that he's going to make himself into a god. Could Luthor be played more sympathetically? Yeah. I think the point is that he's not, and he shouldn't be sympathetic. And is that realistic necessarily? No, you always want to believe that at the core of every person, there's something you could access. But I think for this type of story, Luthor is appropriate.
Thinking about it now, I think a lot of what motivates him is fear. Like fear of his father, fear of Superman, fear of Apocalypse. And in that, he wants to kind of be the one on top of everything that is going to happen, or believes is going to happen, that there is no way to stop the violence that is coming. And the only way he can kind of get on top of it is through more violence.
To be directly involved in it, which is what he's trying to do, but also in the cowardly way of not actually having to enact it.
Yeah, and you know, often fear is said to be the opposite of love. So I think that's kind of an interesting motif we kind of discovered here.
Yeah, no, and I think it's 100% there. I think Snyder's critics almost always play off of this idea that he's working with dumb violence and really like harsh politics. And I think the reason that perception sometimes comes in is because he's trying to reach for something beyond straight politics and go into like we said, mythology, and really dig into sort of like powers above normal human interaction, I guess. There's definitely like more of a meta narrative sometimes than there is a regular narrative.
Yeah, I think he's trying to reach out to like platonic ideas and things like that. And for me, I think he often misses the mark on that. But I don't think he is a dumb filmmaker. I might not enjoy his movies, but I think he thinks a lot about these things. I don't necessarily like all of it, but I can't say he is dumb.
No secret, we said this a million times. I'm a really big fan of his work, especially on these films. And Christian has said in the past that, like where he wasn't necessarily as open to it, that a lot of me talking his ear off about it off recording has kind of opened him up to it, because I do firmly believe that he is reaching for something of a higher order with these narratives. But let's move on with the narrative. Let's condense this, I think is fair. Essentially, through Luthor's plotting, he kidnaps both Lois Lane and Martha Kent. He is also actively creating Doomsday. Doomsday, who he sees as the opposition to the god, being that Luthor's trying to control the devil, is kind of the way that I see this.
He's like pissing in the gene pool here, quite literally. He's like spilling his blood and everything on top of the body of Zod. Is very much. They also play a lot with like the sacraments here, baptism, things like that. Luthor is very literally putting Zod underneath the water and baptizing him into a new life form, and against even the wishes of Zod and of the ship's computer. In that way, is supposed to be playing like with. Oh yeah, this is like the very opposite of Christ, and he is playing as like an antichrist with this kind of twisted baptism.
So we have a scenario now where Luthor has really like broken down Superman to about as much as he can by kidnapping the two people who are arguably most important to him. And now Superman, I think at this point, though they do show him emotional, I think he is pretty resolute that the right thing to do is to try to explain to Batman what's going on. And like anything past that is really a last resort. There's definitely some doubt, but I think that's justified. I think once he returns from the mountain, we really have a more formed Superman. Not quite fully formed, but substantially more so than at the end of Man of Steel.
Yeah, like you said, this is a resolute Superman. And this is also a resolute Batman, but with a very different motive, because he believes, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that Superman was responsible for the attack on the Capitol Hill, and that he needs to kill Superman right now.
I think even if he's not thinking that he's responsible for it in a direct manner, he believes that Superman's presence is creating all of this danger. I believe at this point, Wayne does find out that disgruntled employee had been rejecting his checks and had, not really been taking advantage of anything that he was trying to help him with, which then leads to some scenes where they show his apartment, where it's very clear that he was already, I guess radicalized against Superman would be appropriate. I think it's more a combination of, like I said, this idea that no matter how much good Superman even tries to do, that he's kind of like a poison, and that's how Superman's seeing him. He's seeing him as generating all these problems as opposed to trying to stop them.
I'll talk about it once we finish the plot, but I also think Batman is feeling a sense of guilt because he mentions quite often that he has been in Gotham for 20 years and nothing has changed, despite all the methods he's done.
Yeah, and that brings us back to something we didn't really directly address. We know that Robin is dead.
Or a Robin, because there is a check that says you let him die. And I think that's implicit of like the Joker as well.
There has been some information that's come out on this recently of what the intention was, and with Justice League being released under the Snyder Cut, and with a ton of rumors that the Ayer cut is also pretty much ready to go. One thing that has been confirmed a few times is that is supposed to be Dick Grayson who was killed, and it was supposed to be the Joker that killed him. Specifics past that, there's not a lot out there. There's some rumors, there's some pretty reputable rumors, but I think that's an important part of this too, is this is a Batman who has not dealt with his grief, and it's blinding him. He's not looking at the situation as even he normally would, because things are so out of whack and have been out of whack forever. We've seen that Wayne Manor is burnt to the ground, and we don't know why, but clearly that's not good. This is a Batman who is at his wit's end and is thinking he's doing the right thing because he's blinded by his own grief. And once again, as we were saying, not embracing love. He's not even embracing Alfred, who is trying to tell him frequently through the film that he's not doing it correctly.
Alfred mentions that he thinks he is being paranoid, but Batman keeps coming back with if there's even, 1% chance, we have to take it and stop him. And he kind of tries to actively undermine Lex Luthor, even though Lex Luthor is doing something very similar. And Batman kind of goes out of his way to undermine Lex Luthor at this point.
I think that's such an interesting parallel in the film, is that you do have Batman pursuing the means to destroy Superman, while you have Lex Luthor pursuing the means to destroy Superman, but from completely different points of view and for totally different reasons.
Yeah, it is, but there is also a lot of overlap too, in that they both see Superman as a threat, but Lex Luthor sees him as a ideological and I guess even moral threat, while Batman just sees him as just a physical threat.
See, I would almost disagree. I think Luthor sees Superman as a threat to his ability to control things. And in that sense, maybe Batman does kind of relate to Lex Luthor, but Batman's only seeing it that way because he's trying to protect people, while Luthor wants to stop Superman because he just wants the power.
Right, he wants to be Superman. I would agree with that, and that's part of the reason why he goes so much out of his way to get all these Kryptonian ships and weapons and everything. One thing we did breeze over is the fact that Lex Luthor is talking to the Senate, and he is the one that arranged all these meetings. And because of that, he is getting access to the body of Zod and all these Kryptonian ships and weapons and everything.
Yeah, and he does so all in this really bizarre, creepy manner that I really like. And that was another thing that it was heavily criticized. A lot of people didn't like that. I think that largely comes from, if we look at Luthor in the last even 30 years, his portrayals have not really been creepy. He's always more of obsessed businessman, kind of like an Ahab. I think the overwhelmingly prominent version was from Superman the Animated Series, who was a very business-like, deliberate Luthor, as opposed to this sort of sniveling, conniving Luthor we get in this.
Compare him a lot to Xanathos from Gargoyles, in that they both very rich and they manipulate a lot of people. But here he is. If Snyder does one thing, he comes up with a very different interpretation of these characters, outside of maybe Wonder Woman. But for both Batman and Superman, and almost everybody else, they're very widely different than their comic book origins. Because I think he's looking at these as further down the line and what else you can kind of do with them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's even said the choices on Batman is because he felt there was enough separation between him and the Nolan trilogy, and he really wanted a different Batman for a different generation of films. This Batman is the Dark Knight Returns Batman. Just a slightly different scenario. There are literally shots in the film that are from the comic. But I think you're right on Superman. I think you're right on Luthor. I think you're right on Wonder Woman. But once again, Snyder also knew going into this film that someone else was going to get the Wonder Woman solo film, so he probably wanted to give them a little leeway.
Yeah, and there hasn't been much of a definitive Wonder Woman in the last couple of years. The last one was the one in the 70s, and that wasn't close to the comic book version, which, doesn't really matter all that much. But at this point, Wonder Woman's kind of been exiled from the, I guess, DC Halls of Fame until this point.
Yeah, I think in the comics she was always the heavy hitter, but it's nice to finally see her be. She was always considered part of that holy trinity of the Justice League in the comics, and it's nice to see her elevated to that level in the public eye more. We continue through this. Batman versus Superman, do a lot of punchy. Batman is able to do some punching because of kryptonite weapons. We end up with Batman arguably besting Superman and getting him basically to the point where he could kill him. As we stated, though, Superman doesn't really want to kill Batman, so he's not fighting back probably in the way he would have.
Superman definitely holds back, but also like the Kryptonian gas and everything weakens him pretty heavily for, minutes at a time. And that's partly how Superman gets the upper hand on him and everything.
And this culminates in the scene where Superman is begging Batman to save Martha. Batman immediately starts flashing back to his own parents' death and is trying to figure out why Superman is saying Martha. And of course, we know that that is the name of Superman's mother as well. Once again, another scene that gets torn apart that I don't see the problem with.
Superman's supposed to be asking Batman to save his mother. And, that's the part they're supposed to be bonding over. Them bonding over the name of their parents is the part where everybody kind of has, not literally everybody, but a lot of people have the contention with. Because just saying the name Martha and that fully stopping Batman, who was ready to kill Superman at this point, I think that's where it loses a lot of people.
I disagree entirely. To me, it does what it's supposed to do. It grounds Superman as a person in Batman's brain, which is what he was denying. The whole movie is essentially him denying that Superman is like a person. He's not just a thing. It's taking advantage of something that's existed for a very long time. And I think it's totally fine. Like, I like it because I think Batman, I always see Batman as like he's constantly running scenarios, right? That's how he gets ahead of everything, is he gets how things work. And to throw him off, you would have to dig into like the deepest emotional connections he has, and that's one of them.
Just him saying the name Martha and that stopping Batman, I don't see that as what would stop Batman at that point.
Yeah, I disagree. I think it's the only thing that can stop Batman at that point. I think if he told him like, "Oh no, I'm going to save everybody," then Batman would have cut his head off. Right. Like it's also showing that it's a natural reaction on Superman's part that he's the only thing he cares about in that moment is making sure that his mom doesn't get murdered, because everything went to shit. His whole plan is done. But he knows this guy is capable of saving his mother, so that's what he's going to focus on.
I think like all of Snyder's filmmaking techniques kind of come to a head here, and that's where all the Snyder like anti-fans have such a problem with this film, because it is asking like for you to think all the way back to the beginning of the film and being like, oh yeah, Bruce Wayne's mom is named Martha Wayne, and that's also the same name as Clark Kent's mom. And then I think it is asking the audience a bit too much there. And that is because I don't disagree with it like thematically or anything. I think it is like, yeah, you are right that having to stop Batman at this point, you would have to like attack him emotional or even like appeal to his humanity. I just think like the way Snyder shot it, the way Snyder had them act it, that's where it kind of all falls apart.
I don't think I could disagree more. I do. It's, first of all, like I said, and I admitted this before, I am not sensitive to the argument of making an audience remember anything being a negative. And I get that that's how a lot of screenwriting is sort of constructed and taught. That's why I don't necessarily prescribe to a lot of really successful films either, is I think, to me, that's almost more flawed to not acknowledge things like that. And he does set it up, and it's there over and over again. I don't think it's a stretch to remember it, because when you hear the criticism, it's never focused on people not knowing what it is. It's people criticizing the fact that, oh, I don't think he would say that. I disagree with that, first of all, but no one doesn't understand what it is. If it was hard to understand, okay, maybe there's a little bit of an argument, but I don't think anyone makes it to that point of the movie and doesn't get it.
Sure, but I only think that's the case because so many people have like debated the scene, and it's kind of been like contextualized to death. I think if you're just seeing this movie for the first time and you see that scene, it just plays awkwardly.
Well, when in Rome, right? I feel like we should throw more Anchorman references into every podcast.
It works 100% of the time, 50% of the time.
Yeah. But this does stop Batman from killing Superman. It does finally give Batman this emotional core, reminding what his real motivation should be. And Batman does go off to save Martha. And Superman goes to stop Lex Luthor, now realizing how much he's manipulated everything. Well, he realizes before, really, but this is now he can finally act on it because he knows Batman is going to save his mother.
Right, and then also to a larger extent, Batman and Superman kind of trust each other now.
Right, and that's a huge thing because this is both the love and faith that Jonathan Kent was trying to convey when he showed up as a ghost on a mountain. Superman, upon arriving at Luthor's facility, which is also the ship from Man of Steel, finds that he has created Doomsday. And they do say the words Doomsday, but they don't specifically call him that, thankfully. Superman stops Doomsday from killing Lex Luthor, but Doomsday breaks out.
Yeah, and he breaks out of like a goo egg and everything. Luthor thinks he can kind of control this monster, but very quickly becomes apparent he can't. And then they fight on an abandoned island, and they make sure you know it's abandoned because several characters mention it. Because a big criticism of Man of Steel is that too many people died.
Yeah, it is. It may be the most grating thing in the entire script to me. It's just like, it's fine. Don't tell. It's fine. But this also brings Wonder Woman into action, and we get our big knockdown, drag-out fight. This after Batman saves Martha from KG Beast by going back to a Dark Knight Returns scene. I actually think that sequence is super cool. It doesn't get talked about a lot. That whole fight where he's like dragging people through ceilings and stuff is pretty great.
Yeah, he also blows the shit out of them too.
This is still Batman still hasn't gotten back to like, I'm not going to kill anybody yet. We still have a movie to play with this, okay? But they end up fighting Doomsday. This is kind of your big action sequence of the film. Some convolution with Lois having to get the kryptonite spear, realizing that Doomsday has to be Kryptonian. Superman having to wield the kryptonite spear to kill Doomsday, but ultimately killing himself. There is also a sequence where Superman gets blown up by a nuclear weapon, which is pretty sweet, and ends up looking like Bizarro. But it's a pretty long sequence. I think it's like over a half an hour, if I'm correct.
Yeah, it's really long. There's a bunch of phases to the fight. You know, Batman and Superman are fighting it, then Wonder Woman fights it, then Superman gets the spear from Lois Lane, and it's like the spear of Longelus, and he's stabbing the devil with it.
There are a lot of really great videos and written pieces about the visual references in Batman vs. Superman. We didn't quite get into that too much. We wanted to talk more about the themes. Here there are a few. It mirrors the end of Excalibur, which is referenced in the beginning of the film as one of the films on the marquee at the movie theater. But Superman dies impaling himself to get close enough to really impale Doomsday. The one that is completely overt and unavoidable is the removal of Superman's body from Doomsday's body is 100% Christ being removed from the cross.
It's pretty plain. They're posed exactly the same way, except Snyder's version is very brown and gray.
Yeah. And it has Batman, which is very different. But I think the point of this sequence that I do really like, and I think to me is where it transitions from being the second part of Man of Steel to the first part of Justice League, is you have a threat that's arguably as strong as Zod was, if not stronger. And through the work of Wonder Woman, Superman, and Batman, they are able to stop him. Now, they do kill him, which I'm sure there was some criticism on too, but it's Doomsday. I don't know if you're going to consider a sentient being. I'm not sure.
Clones aren't people.
Clones aren't people. That's like every science fiction movie. But to be fair, at least to some comic book origins, both Superman and Doomsday died in that original fight, and then both came back anyway, so it's fine, whatever. Superman's death, I think, is really well played in this, and I think it was also really unexpected. I know I didn't expect it when I went into the movie. Even seeing Doomsday didn't make me think they were going to go that far, but I think it's cool that they did.
I mean, the problem is that I saw this movie like after it came out, so I kind of knew a lot of the twists within it. So I wasn't shocked when Superman died. But I think the implications of his death are explored in Justice League a lot more. Well, in Whedon's version, it kind of is. In Snyder's version,
Yeah,
I'm
I
sure
don't even
it's
think
a
it's
lot
fair to
more.
call it Whedon's version, knowing what everyone seems to know. Yeah, his death in this film, I think, is portrayed really interestingly, where they even sort of directly mention that society doesn't really know what to do when he dies. And, there's a lot of imagery very similar to the death of John F. Kennedy, which was, I think, to evoke an idea of like a figure who had brought a lot of hope dying and now the world not really knowing what to do.
Right. His death is supposed to bring a lot of people out of the shadows. And then they kind of also acknowledge that there were two versions of Superman, one being Clark Kent the man, and one being Superman the symbol, and there is two separate graves for him, one on the farm and one, I believe, on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to either be Capitol Hill or Arlington National Cemetery, something to that effect. But the idea is there that in death, his life is sort of reconciled. You also get hints of him kind of increasing in awareness of his own power. He does rescue Lois from drowning because he hears her while in the middle of a battle, which something in Man of Steel that would have been like incomprehensible. Like that wasn't the Superman you had yet. So it starts to hint at this expansion of power, even if it's just based more on him psychologically understanding what he's doing. So you really do have these sort of two separate entities. While all this is going on, we completely forgot to mention that both Wonder Woman and Batman are also aware of Aquaman, Cyborg, The Flash, because they find the file that Lex Luthor is building.
And they make one of the worst versions of Cyborg.
Oh, okay, that's not fair. We didn't even get to see what he's supposed to be like.
Yeah, not yet. I just don't like the whole mother box thing with him.
Well, you can't blame him for that one. You can blame Jeff Johns. But we're gonna be more enlightened to what Cyborg was supposed to be very soon. But we do get those hints. It's funny because it really is not until the end of the film that it feels like this has anything to do with Justice League, which I think is good. I think that focus on Batman Superman's struggle, like with purpose and everything, is way more interesting than just setting up a bunch of characters. But they do set up the characters a little bit. Bruce and Diana are at the funeral in Smallville, and you get your first hints that they're organizing for something that's coming. Bruce being fairly confident in this because of the visions he's been having, and probably realizing that that weird guy who came out of the portal probably meant something.
Yeah, and then Wonder Woman, of course, knows about it because they've dealt with it for thousands of years at this point.
It does end on a cool note in that sense, and also I think the casket being buried and your indication that this isn't over being dirt slightly rising off of it and then cutting really like quickly is kind of cool too.
Yeah, I like that shot a lot. Even though I'm not really sure what's going on there, the implication is pretty clear about it, which is what I like. I like that it's just a very quick, sudden cut. Again, like people have complained about this, is like, what does the lifting of the dirt mean? Superman can't lift dirt, which yeah, I guess. As some people said, he was being teleported away, which is not the case.
No.
But I think it's more about the implication that Superman is somewhat still alive or will come alive again.
And also, I'm going to put this out there. If you want to get like real nerdy and criticize dirt lifting around Superman, if you go with the post-crisis Superman origin, there is a very direct reference to the fact that his powers are coming from some sort of telekinesis. So there you go.
That's a deep cut.
It's a deep cut. And Connor Kent also at some points had access to like tactical telekinesis because it was established I think it's in Man of Steel, the original miniseries, that's where a lot of the sort of like not really well explained powers come from, is basically Superman can kind of generate energy around himself. There you go. I think we can probably get to some like final thoughts on Batman versus Superman. Be done until well, if you guys like this, I think we'd be happy to talk about the movies that have come out since this and maybe the impacts they're going to have going forward. Batman versus Superman is the reason Dissecting Fiction exists. And that's a weird statement to make, but I made it a few times, and I'll explain it a little bit here. I was doing a lot of freelance at the time that the film came out, and I just saw this like vicious, like completely not critical attacks on the movie, and I just got sick of it. And I was like, all right, I gotta write something, because I saw all of this subtext in the movie. I saw all this mythological stuff. And if you go on dissectingfiction.com and you scroll all the way back to the first thing that ever runs on the site, it's a Batman vs. Superman article. And I just wanted like a place where I felt like we could try to get back to more civil criticism. I think it's starting to happen a little organically now. A lot of websites have toned it back, but for a long time, especially like within the last decade, I feel like a lot of websites were just writing attack pieces to get attention. And to me, Batman vs. Superman was like the pinnacle of that. Like, I just watched this movie get dragged through like crap all the time. And it's like, I didn't ever felt that the Marvel films were much better. And same critics who would seemingly like praise all the destruction in Avengers would then go after the DC movies. It was very like disturbing to me. And it's really, like I said, the genesis of this entire project that we're doing. I love the movie. I think it's successful thematically. I'm not going to make the argument that it isn't a little messy during the film. I think it's certainly messier than Man of Steel, but I think by the end of it, you get all the right feelings. And to me, that's as important as anything else.
You've certainly talked my ear off about this many times, but you have had me come around a bit more on Batman versus Superman, because there is a hell of a lot of criticism against this movie. Not all of it unwarranted, but a lot of it is kind of coming from this place of just people not liking Snyder's film direction, not liking the way he kind of explores things, and not liking the way he kind of directs actors and everything. And then, of course, there's tons of interviews, too, that made a lot of fans annoyed and pissed off at him. And I do think it is a bit unwarranted, because I think you have to engage this film on its level, which is slightly higher than like a Marvel movie or something like Shazam or Wonder Woman, because it is asking you to do a bit more in-depth reading and symbolic work on it. Like I said earlier, I don't really like these films. Whenever action tends to happen in these films, I kind of just zone completely out. And that's the case even too in like Marvel films too. Like especially the end of Infinity War, I like half of that I don't remember. I remember Thor picking up a hammer and Captain America picking up the hammer and Iron Man saying "I am Iron Man," and that's about it. But I do think these films are trying to say something, but I'm not super sure what they're trying to say all the time, because Snyder is trying to go to these more symbolic ideas. For example, I'm not really sure, like Superman is supposed to be like a Christ-like figure in these films, but like Christ means different things to many people. And I'm not sure, like for me, like I'm not sure what Superman would have said in that setting hearing. And for me, that's kind of a damning piece of the puzzle to me, because it speaks to Snyder reaching out to these higher ideas, but not actually grasping.
I would agree that you can criticize execution. I think if anything, the Christ parallel is playing off of, first of all, the idea of suffering to save everyone, and also the more than one moment of doubt. And I think he cuts off Superman from speaking at the Senate hearing because he feels that the explanation that you get on that mountaintop is the explanation you need. You don't need political discourse to explain the idea that Superman's following.
But political discourse, like the whole, that's like the first half of the film. It's almost all political discourse. And then he loads this with all like 9/11 imagery and everything, and all this talk about like aliens and things like that.
Well, I would argue that that's part of the progression of the story, is that he's moving past that. That obviously that's where you start in the real world. And as the movie moves forward, we're getting further and further away from our reality and more in the reality that could have a Wonder Woman and a Superman.
But I do want to ask you, what do you think Superman would have said at the Senate hearing? Do you think he would have Congress kind of monitor him, or would he have said, I can act on my own?
It's an interesting question. I think he may have let them monitor him, but not in like a all-inclusive way. I feel like that his argument would be, okay, I'm going to continue to try to help, but you can do this. He would have been, I think Superman would be diplomatic in a situation like that. He's not going to completely bend to their will, but he's also not going to, he wouldn't have disregarded the arguments against him. And so it would have to be some sort of middle ground, would be my thought. But I think part of the point of that ultimately, too, is that since we do learn that Luthor is essentially manipulating most of this criticism, part of the reason we don't get that type of resolution is because the explosion is part of the proof that the argument wasn't valid, which in reality doesn't really function. But I think, like we said, in this like heightened mythological version of things, I think you can get away with it.
Because for me, I'm not sure what Superman would have said, because at times he seems like the criticisms against him are completely unwarranted. And then at other times the criticism against him are warranted. And then there's kind of his opinions on Batman being like this vigilante, but then at the same time he's a vigilante too. And I think moments like that are what hurt the film for me. Outside of just me not super liking a lot of Snyder's techniques, but that's a taste thing.
Right, and I'll give you that, you know, if you were looking for the answer that way and it seems like the rug got pulled out from under the narrative, I'll agree to that to a certain extent. But I think, like I said, I think everything that you need to cover does end up getting covered in the mountaintop scene. That's the courtroom to me. It's him talking to someone who he knows has his best interests in mind and isn't going to, and certainly by virtue of the story itself, is not dismissing that there are problems, but is trying to get past those problems, which government isn't very good at doing.
Yeah, no, it's just for me, like, I felt like a lot of this film was about justice, and then it kind of brushes aside about, like, power, responsibility, and justice for a lot of that fight with Doomsday, because we don't even get Batman's full opinions on that, because it seems like Batman has a lot of complex opinions on that, that Superman seems to have some complex opinions on that, but we don't actually ever see them actually speak their mind on that to me. And then this other aspect that Snyder focuses a lot on the power of these two heroes rather than the humanity. But then again, you can also say, like, well, you know, the Justice League Unlimited films, the Justice League show, Batman, the animated series, all those have explored the humanity of these characters quite a lot. And Snyder's trying to explore something very different here.
I would agree with that. I think there is a lot of dialogue of this already existing in other media. And I think that Snyder was intentionally trying to go a different way with it.
But at the same time, he also tries to appeal to this, like, idea that Superman's always right, too, because that is how he is often in media. And the same thing with Batman, too. Like, Batman's often right in his stories, too. And I think he doesn't really fully explore who of these two is righter or who is righteous. And that's where the film, I think, falls flat for me.
I don't totally agree with that. I think Superman is righter. I'll go with that. I think it's playing with the idea, though, of two characters. Superman is really trying to find, you know, justice, and Batman has lost track of it. And it's them coming to a middle ground where they can finally go in the right direction together, which is, like I said, that very small portion of the film that I actually do feel like is the beginning of Justice League is that. For the most part, it's about the tension between all of these factors, and rightfully so. It should be the majority of the film. But yeah, I don't know. I don't totally agree with that. I think it does accomplish it.
That's fair. I think this film, like, if you engage with it on his level, it gives you a lot to think about. But I don't know if Snyder fully resolves that, and that's my main complaint of that.
Yeah, and I would say that some of the unresolved plot points are probably coming in his version of Justice League. I think this continual ascension of Superman has to pay off somewhere, and that's got to be it.
Yeah, he's going to punch Darkseid in the face.
Yeah, I mean that's how you accomplish. That's how you accomplish anything, is punching your villains in the face. We all know that.
Yeah, remember when Jesus punched Satan in the face in the desert?
Yeah, that's what made Passion of the Christ like the biggest movie ever. Well, now that we've lost a few listeners, if you've enjoyed the show, you can find us on pretty much all social media. Just type in Dissecting Fiction. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You'll find us. We also love it when you comment or send anything back. We both really are interested to see if anyone wants to hear us talk about the other DCEU films outside of the Snyder films. We're going to hold off on Justice League until probably right before Zack Snyder's Justice League comes out, just so give you guys a little primer as we're going into that. As we've been saying for weeks upon weeks, things are getting a little better as far as stores being able to open, but do check out toystoreguide.com. See if you can find anything. These businesses, even though, as we said, things are starting to open up, they still really, really need the business. A lot of resources on there, and keep an eye out for your local comic shops, any of those small businesses.
Definitely comment on our social media if you wanted us to at least talk about Justice League, because I don't think either of us have many good opinions of that movie. And if you want to just hear us tear into something, that'll probably be it.
Yeah, it would be. I think the only thing that I would probably get more unreasonable about would be an Iron Man 3 podcast. But you see, we try to say, like we were saying, we're not trying to be super inflammatory, but I mean, if we're gonna have to talk about Justice League, it's not gonna be that much fun. But I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And thanks for listening.